The warning lights flashed red across the control panel as Lieutenant Commander Leonari fought to keep her ship steady. The transport vessel Aegis Dawn shook violently as another wave of electromagnetic energy hit its hull. Through the viewport, she could see the massive green planet below, covered in what looked like an endless forest. "Engine core failing," shouted her pilot, Sergeant Han Minho, his hands moving quickly over the controls. "The electromagnetic storms are tearing our systems apart." Nari gripped her command chair as the ship tilted sharply to the left. They had been on a simple survey mission to map this new world called Verdania Prime. The planet had looked peaceful from space, with its green forests and blue oceans. Nobody had expected the violent storms that seemed to come from the planet itself. "Can we make it to orbit?" Nari asked, though she already knew the answer from the alarms screaming around them. "Negative, Commander," Minho replied, sweat running down his face. "We're going down." The ship's medical officer, Kim Tae-ho, rushed into the command center. His face was pale as he looked at the readings on his portable scanner. "Commander, the radiation levels are getting dangerous. We need to get to the escape pods now." Nari made the hardest decision of her military career. "All hands abandon ship. This is not a drill. Report to escape pods immediately." The crew moved with trained efficiency, but Nari could see the fear in their eyes. They were far from any human colonies, and no rescue ships would come looking for them for weeks. The escape pods were designed for short-term survival, not long-term colonization. As the ship broke apart around them, Nari reached her assigned escape pod. The small chamber was barely big enough for two people, with basic survival supplies and a medical unit. She strapped herself in as the automated systems began the launch sequence. "Pod systems check. Error. Error." "The computer," voice announced. Nari's heart sank as she realized her pod systems were damaged by the electromagnetic interference. Through the small window, she watched as the other escape pods launched safely, their bright trails disappearing into the planet's atmosphere. Her pod was the last one, and something was wrong with the launch mechanism. Kim Tae-ho's voice crackled through the failing communication system. "Nar, your pod's medical systems are down. The radiation exposure is already severe. Even with immediate treatment, your survival chances are less than 1%. The pod finally launched, but Nari could feel that something was wrong. The automatic guidance system wasn't working, and the pod was spinning out of control as it fell toward the planet. She tried to use the manual controls, but they were barely responding. The planet rushed up to meet her. Through the spinning viewport, she caught glimpses of massive trees that seemed to glow with their own light. The forest looked ancient and wild, unlike anything she had seen on other worlds. The pod's emergency systems tried to slow her descent, but the parachutes only partially deployed. Nari braced herself as the trees grew larger and larger. She could see now that they were enormous, some reaching hundreds of meters into the sky. Their leaves seemed to shimmer with strange colors. The impact came like a hammer blow. The pod crashed through several layers of branches before slamming into the forest floor. The safety harness cut into Nari's chest as she was thrown forward. Pain shot through her entire body, and she tasted blood in her mouth when the world stopped. Spinning, Nari found herself hanging upside down in her harness. The pod had landed on its side against a massive tree trunk. Through the cracked viewport, she could see strange blue and green lights moving through the forest. The air outside glowed with a soft, eerie light that seemed to come from the plants themselves. She tried to move and immediately regretted it. Pain flared through her left arm and ribs. The medical scanner built into her suit was still working, and the readings made her stomach drop. Internal bleeding, 3 broken ribs, severe radiation poisoning, and a concussion. Kim Tae-ho had been right about her chances. The pod's emergency supplies had scattered during the crash. She could see water containers and food packets mixed with broken equipment. The communication array was completely destroyed, meaning she couldn't contact the other survivors or call for help outside. She heard sounds that definitely weren't made by any Earth animals. Something howled in the distance, a sound that seemed to echo off the massive trees. Closer, she could hear what sounded like clicking and chittering. As if insects the size of dogs were moving through the undergrowth. Nari managed to free herself from the harness and crawled toward the pod's emergency kit. Every movement sent waves of pain through her body, but she forced herself to keep going. The kit contained basic medical supplies, a small laser cutter, some emergency food, and a portable shelter generator. She activated the medical injector and felt the pain medication flow into her system. It helped, but she knew it was only temporary. The radiation poisoning would get worse over the next few days, and she had no way to treat it properly. The sounds outside were getting closer. Through the viewport she could see shapes moving between the trees. They looked like animals, but they moved in a way that seemed too intelligent, too coordinated. Some of them had what looked like crystalline growths on their backs that glowed with the same light as the plants. Nari realized she couldn't stay in the pod. It was damaged and would offer no protection against whatever lived in this forest. She needed to find shelter and figure out how to survive until rescue came. If rescue came, she gathered what supplies she could carry and activated the pod's emergency beacon. Even if the communication systems were down, the beacon might help the other survivors find her. She hoped they had landed safely somewhere on this strange world. Using the laser cutter, she opened the pod's emergency hatch. The moment she stepped outside, she felt the difference in the air. It was thick and humid, filled with scents she couldn't identify. The electromagnetic energy that had destroyed their ship seemed to come from the very ground beneath her feet. The trees around her were like nothing she had ever seen. Their bark had a metallic sheen, and their leaves moved even though there was no wind. Some of the smaller plants seemed to react to her presence, their glowing parts growing brighter as she passed. In the distance, she could hear water running. A stream or river would be essential for survival. She picked a direction and started walking, every step sending pain through her injured body. Behind her, the wrecked escape pod looked very small among the giant trees. As darkness began to fall, the forest came alive with light. Thousands of plants began to glow more brightly, creating a landscape that looked like something from a dream. But Nari knew this was no dream. This was a fight for survival on an alien world, and the odds were against her. She had been given a 1% chance of living through the next few days. Looking up at the strange stars visible through the forest canopy, Nari made a promise. To herself, she would prove those odds wrong. She would survive. No matter what this world threw at her. The forest watched her with 1,000 glowing eyes as she disappeared into the wilderness, beginning a journey that would change everything. Nari woke up 3 days later with her face pressed against cold, damp earth. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was or how she had gotten there. Then the pain hit her like a wave, and everything came flooding back. The crash, the forest, the desperate search for water that had ended with her collapsing beside a small stream. She tried to sit up and immediately felt dizzy. Her survival suit's medical scanner was beeping frantically, showing readings that should have meant she was dead. The radiation poisoning had gotten worse, just as she had expected. Her body temperature was too high, and the internal bleeding hadn't stopped, but somehow she was still alive. The forest around her looked different in the morning light. The trees still glowed, but more softly now, like they were saving their energy for the night. She could hear the stream nearby and smell something that reminded her of flowers mixed with metal. Nari crawled to the water's edge and used her suit's filtration system to fill her water containers. The stream was clear, running over rocks that seemed to shimmer with the same strange energy as everything else on this world. Small fish-like creatures swam in the deeper pools, their scales reflecting rainbow colors. As she drank, she heard a sound that made her blood freeze. It was a low, growling noise, coming from somewhere behind her. She turned slowly and saw them. 3 creatures stood at the edge of the clearing, watching her with intelligence that was unmistakably hostile. They looked like wolves, but they were the size of bears, with crystalline growths covering their shoulders and backs. Their eyes glowed the same blue-green as the forest plants, and their claws looked like they were made of polished metal. Nari reached for the laser cutter she had taken from the escape pod. It was a tool, not a weapon, but it was all she had. The creatures began to circle her, moving with the coordination of a pack that had hunted together many times. The largest one, with crystals that glowed brighter than the others, stepped forward. Nari could see scars on its hide, proof that it was an experienced fighter. It opened its mouth, showing teeth that looked like they could bite through metal, and made a sound that was part roar, part electronic buzz. Nari had been trained for combat, but always against human enemies or known alien species. These creatures were something completely new, and she had no idea how they would attack or what their weaknesses might be. The attack came faster than she expected. The largest creature leaped at her while the other two flanked her from both sides. Nari rolled backward into the stream, using the water to slow their charge. The laser cutter in her hand hummed to life, its cutting beam slicing through the air. The beam caught the lead creature across its shoulder, cutting through crystal and flesh. The creature howled and stumbled, but didn't go down. Its blood was a strange silver color that seemed to glow as it hit the ground. The other two creatures hesitated, clearly surprised that their prey could fight back. Nari used their confusion to her advantage, scrambling up the far bank of the stream and putting some distance between herself and the pack. But the creatures were learning. They spread out wider this time, trying to cut off her escape routes. The wounded leader was angry now, its crystal growths pulsing with bright light as it stalked toward her. Nari's mind raced, looking for anything she could use. The trees were too massive to climb quickly, and the undergrowth was too thick to run through. She needed to make a stand here. The laser cutter had limited power, maybe enough for a few more minutes of continuous use. She would have to make each shot count. The second attack was more coordinated. All three creatures rushed her at once, trying to overwhelm her defenses. Nari waited until the last possible second, then dove to one side while firing the laser at the nearest creature's legs. The beam severed tendons and muscle, sending the creature crashing into a tree, but the other two were already on her. Claws raked across her back, tearing through her survival suit. She could feel blood running down her spine. Nari spun around and shoved the laser cutter directly into the face of the creature behind her. At point-blank range, the cutting beam went straight through crystal and bone. The creature died instantly, its body falling heavily on top of her. The pack leader was the only one left now, but it was the most dangerous. It circled her slowly, making that electronic buzzing sound that seemed to come from its crystal growths. Nari realized the crystals weren't just armor. They were some kind of communication or sensing organ. She was bleeding, exhausted, and nearly out of power for her only weapon. The creature seemed to know this. It was taking its time, wearing her down. Nari looked around desperately for anything that might help. That's when she noticed something strange about the plants around the clearing. They were reacting to the fight, their glow patterns changing and pulsing in rhythm with the creature's crystals. The forest was watching. The leader made its final attack, leaping high into the air with claws extended. Nari threw herself backward, using the last of the laser cutter's power to fire straight up. The beam caught the creature in the chest as it came down, burning through its crystal armor and into its heart. The creature crashed down beside her and lay still. Its crystal growth slowly faded from bright blue to dull gray. Nari sat beside the stream, surrounded by the bodies of 3 alien predators, and tried to process what had just happened. She had survived her first real encounter with Verdania's wildlife, but just barely, and she was certain there were much worse things in this forest than crystal wolves. She used water from the stream to clean her wounds and applied medical patches from her emergency kit. The cuts weren't deep, but they burned with a strange tingling sensation. She hoped it wasn't from some kind of alien poison. As she worked, she studied the dead creatures more carefully. Their claws were indeed made of some kind of organic metal, probably grown the same way earth animals grew keratin. The crystal growths were hollow, filled with what looked like some kind of bioelectrical fluid. Most interesting was how their bodies seemed to be connected to the forest's energy network. Even in death, the crystals still responded weakly to the pulses of light from nearby plants. These creatures weren't just animals. They were part of Verdania's living ecosystem. Nari realized that if she was going to survive on this world, she needed to understand how that ecosystem worked. She couldn't just fight her way through every encounter. She would run out of weapons and energy long before she ran out of predators. She cut some meat from the smallest creature and cooked it over a small fire made with the laser cutter's remaining power. It tasted strange, with a metallic flavor that reminded her of the glowing plants. But it was protein, and she needed all the strength she could get. As night fell and the forest began to glow again, Nari made her first camp. She built a small shelter between two large rocks near the stream, using salvaged material from her escape pod. It wasn't much, but it would keep the rain off and give her a defensible position. She had learned something important today. The creatures of Verdania could be killed, but they were dangerous and intelligent. More importantly, they were connected to the forest in ways she didn't understand yet. If she was going to survive, she would need to become part of that connection. She would need to learn the rules of this world and find her place in its strange ecosystem. The odds were still against her, but she had proven today that 1% was more than 0, and sometimes that was enough. 3 weeks had passed since Nari's first fight with the crystal wolves, and her body was doing something impossible. According to every medical scanner she had, she should have been dead from radiation poisoning by now. Instead, she felt stronger. Each day, the wounds on her back had healed completely, leaving only faint scars that seemed to glow slightly in the dark. Her broken ribs had mended faster than should have been possible. Most strange of all, her vision had improved. She could see clearly in the forest's dim light, and she was beginning to notice patterns in the way the plants pulsed that she had missed before. Nari stood at the edge of her camp, looking out at the territory she now considered her own. She had claimed a section of forest around the bend-in, the stream, where the trees formed a natural barrier and the water ran clear and fast. Over the past weeks, she had turned it into something that looked more like a military base than a survival shelter. The walls were built from salvaged metal, plates taken from her escape pod, reinforced with crystalline bones from the creatures she had killed. She had learned to work the alien materials using heat from controlled fires and pressure from heavy stones. The crystal bones were incredibly strong once they cooled, and they seemed to naturally channel the forest's electromagnetic energy. Her weapons had improved too. The laser cutter was long dead, its power cell drained. But Nari had crafted new tools from the materials around her. She carried a spear tipped with a crystal wolf's claw and a bow made from the flexible wood of the younger trees. Her arrows were tipped with sharpened crystal fragments that could punch through the toughest hide. More importantly, she had begun to understand the forest's rhythms. The glowing patterns weren't random. They were a form of communication, a network that connected every plant and many of the animals across vast distances. During the day, the network carried information about weather and food sources. At night, it warned of dangers and predators. Nari had learned to read some of the simpler patterns. A rapid pulse meant immediate danger. Slow, steady waves indicated calm conditions. Complex spiraling patterns seemed to mark territorial boundaries between different groups of creatures. She had also learned that the forest was watching her. At first, she thought it was her imagination. But as the weeks passed, it became clear that the plants around her camp were responding to her presence in ways they didn't respond to other creatures. When she was injured, nearby trees would produce more of the healing sap she had learned to use as medicine. When she was building her walls, vines would grow to provide natural camouflage. It was as if Verdania itself was helping her survive. Nari tested this theory by deliberately cutting herself with a crystal blade and sitting near different types of plants. Some ignored her completely. Others seemed to sense her injury and began producing substances that helped with healing or pain relief. She carefully noted which plants were helpful and which were indifferent. The most responsive plants were the large trees with metallic bark that she had started calling guardian trees. These ancient giants seemed to be the center of the forest's communication network. When she sat against their trunks, she could feel a faint tingling sensation, as if gentle electricity was flowing through her body. Her hunting skills had improved dramatically. She had mapped the movement patterns of several species and learned to predict where they would be at different times of day. The crystal wolves hunted in packs of 3 to 5, usually at dawn and dusk. The six-legged deer creatures, with mirror-like scales, grazed in the meadows during midday. And the snake-like things with too many eyes only came out during the darkest part of the night. Nari had killed representatives of each species, studying their anatomy and learning their weaknesses. The crystal wolves were fastest, but had poor endurance. The mirror deer were nearly impossible to approach directly, but had terrible peripheral vision. The night snakes were nearly blind, but could sense vibrations through the ground from incredible distances. She had also discovered that each species was connected to the forest network in different ways. The wolves used their crystal growths to communicate with each other and with the plants. The deer seemed to navigate using reflections from their scales that picked up the forest's light patterns. The snakes appeared to tap directly into the underground root networks. The more Nari learned, the more she realized that Verdania wasn't just a planet with life on it. It was a single, massive living organism, and every creature was part of its nervous system, including, apparently, her. The evidence was becoming hard to ignore. Her healing rate had increased far beyond human normal. Her senses were adapting to perceive the forest's electromagnetic patterns. And sometimes, when she was very still and quiet, she could feel something vast and ancient touching the edges of her mind. Nari had been a military officer, trained to think logically and scientifically. The idea that a planet could be alive and intelligent should have seemed impossible. But she was living proof that impossible things happened on Verdania. She decided to test her growing connection to the forest more directly. One morning, she sat against the largest guardian tree near her camp and tried to deliberately reach out with her mind. At first, nothing happened. Then, slowly, she began to sense something. It was like hearing a conversation in a language she almost understood. Images and feelings flowed through her consciousness. She saw the forest from above, as if she were a bird flying over the canopy. She felt the contentment of the deer creatures as they grazed in sunny meadows. She sensed the pack bonds of the crystal wolves as they hunted together, and she felt something else. Something large and metal and wrong, moving through the forest far to the south. Machines that didn't belong, carrying creatures that felt alien in a way that even the crystal wolves, DIDN single quote T. Nari, opened her eyes and immediately began preparing for war. If her connection to the forest was real, then something was threatening. Verdania from the south, something that didn't belong to the planet's natural ecosystem. And based on the feelings she had sensed through the network, whatever it was had hostile intentions. She spent the next few days expanding her weapon collection and fortifying her camp. She crafted more arrows and spears, and she built hidden supply caches throughout her territory. If enemies were coming, she would be ready for them, but more than that, she began to realize that she wasn't just fighting for her own survival anymore. Verdania had kept her alive when she should have died. It had healed her injuries and enhanced her abilities. It had made her stronger and faster and more perceptive than any human had a right to be. In return, she would protect it. Nari looked out at the glowing forest that had become her home and felt a fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. She had been changed by this world, molded by its energy and connected to its consciousness. She was no longer just a stranded human trying to survive. She was becoming something new. Something that belonged to Verdania as much as the crystal wolves or the guardian trees. And if anything threatened her world, she would show them exactly what a human could become when pushed beyond all limits. The forest pulsed with approving light around her, and Nari knew that Verdania understood. They were partners now, predator and planet, working together against whatever dangers were approaching from the south. The 1% chance of survival had become something much more interesting. She had become part of the ecosystem itself, and that ecosystem was about to go to war. Nari crouched in the shadows between two massive guardian trees, watching the alien camp through eyes that could now see clearly in near total darkness. The enemies had arrived exactly where the forest network had predicted they would, setting Up their base in a clearing about 5 kilometers south of her territory. They were not human. The creatures moving around the camp were tall and thin, with 4 arms and skin that looked like polished stone. They wore armor that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and they carried weapons that hummed with energy similar to what she felt from Verdania's trees. But where the forest's energy felt warm and alive, theirs felt cold and dead. Nari had been observing them for 3 days, learning their patterns and counting their numbers. There were 12 of them, led by a commander whose armor was decorated with symbols that hurt her eyes to look at directly. They had set up some kind of research station with machines that extended metal probes deep into the ground and scanners that swept the area with beams of harsh, white light. Most disturbing were the cages. The aliens had captured several of Verdania's native creatures and were keeping them in metal enclosures that blocked the forest's energy. Nari could see crystal wolves pacing frantically in their prisons, their natural glow fading as they were cut off from the planet's network. Mira deer stood motionless, their scales dull and lifeless. Even one of the night snakes coiled in a corner, its many eyes clouded with what looked like pain. Through her connection to the forest, Nari could feel the suffering of the imprisoned creatures. Their distress sent ripples of anguish through the entire network like a wound that wouldn't heal. The guardian trees around the alien camp had begun to wither, their bark turning gray and their leaves falling, whatever the aliens were doing. It was poisoning Verdania itself. Nari had learned enough of their language over the past few days to understand that they called themselves the Kethmar. They were researchers, but their research involved cutting into living creatures and extracting what they called bioenergy matrices. They seemed particularly interested in the way Verdania's life forms connected to the planet's electromagnetic field. From what she could overhear, they were trying to weaponize that connection. The commander, who the others called Vestan, spoke often about creating soldiers who could control entire ecosystems. He talked about turning planets into weapons, using their own life forces against their inhabitants. He bragged about how much the Kethmar military would pay for such technology. Nari had heard enough. It was time to act. She began her campaign the next night, starting with their supply lines. The Kethmar had set up automated cargo drones that flew between their base and their landing site several kilometers away. The drones followed a predictable path through the forest, staying low to avoid the larger trees. Nari positioned herself along that path with a bow made from guardian tree wood and arrows tipped with crystal Volf claws. The first drone went down without ever knowing it was under attack. The arrow punched through its hull and severed critical control circuits. It crashed into the forest canopy, its cargo of research equipment scattered and ruined. The second drone she brought down differently. She had learned to work with Verdania's network, asking the trees to grow new branches across the drone's flight path at precisely the right moment. The machine flew straight into a barrier that hadn't existed moments before, destroying itself completely. By the third night, the Kethmar were sending escorts with their supply drones. Nari adapted, using her knowledge of the forest to set ambush that struck from multiple directions at once. Vines would entangle the escort soldiers while arrows found gaps in their armor. Trees would suddenly shift, creating walls that separated groups of enemies so she could deal with them one at a time. The aliens began calling her the Ghost of the Green. They couldn't understand how a single enemy could strike from anywhere in the forest and then disappear without a trace. Their scanners couldn't track her through the electromagnetic interference generated by the guardian trees. Their thermal sensors were useless against someone whose body temperature now matched the forest around her. Nari's connection to Verdania gave her advantages no conventional enemy could match. She knew where every patrol would be before they left their base. She could feel their emotions through the network when they stepped on certain plants. She could even influence their path by asking the forest to make some routes more difficult and others more appealing, but her greatest advantage was that she understood what they were fighting for. The Kethmar were conquerors who saw Verdania as a resource to be exploited. They had no connection to the world beyond what they could take from it. Nari, on the other hand, was fighting for her home. Every tree, every stream, every creature in the forest was under her protection now. She felt their pain when the aliens hurt them, and she felt their joy when she struck back at their enemies. After 2 weeks of constant attacks, Commander Vestan made a crucial mistake. Frustrated by his inability to catch the ghost, he ordered his soldiers to begin destroying sections of the forest with energy weapons. If he couldn't stop the attacks, he reasoned, he would eliminate the places from which they came, the moment the first guardian tree fell to Kethmer weapons. Nari felt its death like a knife through her heart. The entire forest network shuddered with grief and rage. Plants that had been merely responsive to her presence before now actively helped her hunt. The creatures that had murdered one of their ancient guardians. Nari's retaliation was swift and merciless. She struck their base directly for the first time, using passages through the root network that the aliens didn't know existed. She emerged from the ground inside their perimeter and destroyed 3 research stations before they even knew she was there. When they tried to pursue her, the very earth opened up beneath their feet, dropping them into root-lined tunnels where night snakes waited in the darkness. But her most devastating attack was psychological. Nari began leaving evidence of her presence around their camp. Crystal Volf claws arranged in threatening patterns. Mirror scales that reflected distorted images back at the aliens. Messages written in their own language using the sap from guardian trees, telling them exactly what she planned to do to them. If they didn't leave Verdania immediately, the Kethmer were used to fighting conventional enemies with predictable tactics. They had no experience dealing with an opponent who could turn an entire planet against them. Their soldiers became nervous and jumpy, firing at shadows and seeing threats in every unusual plant growth. Several attempted to desert only to find that the forest itself had become hostile to them. Paths they had used safely before now led them in circles. Streams they had drunk from before now made them sick. Plants that had ignored them now released clouds of irritating spores whenever they passed. Commander Vestan tried to restore order by making examples of the deserters, but this only made his remaining soldiers more frightened. They began to whisper that the planet itself was alive and hunting them. Some claimed they could hear voices in the wind, speaking in languages that predated their civilization. They weren't wrong. Through her connection to Verdania, Nari had learned to use the forest's voice as a weapon. She could make the trees whisper threats in perfect Kethmer, could cause the very ground to vibrate with ominous sounds. She turned their superstitions against them, making them believe they were fighting something supernatural rather than a single enhanced human. After a month of constant pressure, the Kethmer were down to 8 soldiers plus their commander. Their research had been completely disrupted. Their equipment was failing due to constant sabotage, and their morale had collapsed entirely, but Vestan was not ready to give up. Nari intercepted communications indicating that he had called for reinforcements and was planning a final assault on what he had identified as the center of Verdania's bio-network. He intended to destroy the largest guardian trees, hoping to cripple the planet's ability to coordinate against him. Nari felt the forest sphere through the network. If Vestan succeeded in damaging the core trees, it would be like cutting out Verdania's brain. The planet might survive, but it would never be the same. The time for stealth and sabotage was over. The final battle was coming, and it would determine the fate of everything she had sworn to protect. Nari began preparing for war. Nari stood in the heart of the forest, surrounded by the ancient guardian trees that formed Verdania's living core. Their massive trunks rose like pillars into the canopy above, their metallic bark pulsing with deep blue light that seemed to come from the planet's very soul. Through her enhanced connection to the network, she could feel their consciousness touching hers, vast and patient and older than human civilization. The transformation that had been slowly building in her body over the past months was now complete. Her reflexes were faster than any baseline human could achieve. Her senses could detect electromagnetic signatures from kilometers away. Her skin had developed a faint luminescent quality that let her blend perfectly with the forest's natural glow. Most remarkably, her nervous system had become partially integrated with Verdania's bio-network, allowing her to process information at superhuman speeds. She was no longer entirely human, but she was still entirely herself. The guardian trees shared their knowledge with her as she prepared for the final confrontation. Through their ancient memories, she learned about other worlds the Kethmer had destroyed. Planets stripped of their bioenergy and left as lifeless rocks floating in space. Entire ecosystems reduced to raw materials for weapons that could turn. Living worlds against their own inhabitants. Verdania would not suffer that fate. Not while she lived to prevent it. Commander Vex Thalen had made his position clear in intercepted communications. He planned to bring in a full battle group of Kethmer warriors equipped with planet-killing weapons. They would destroy the Guardian trees, extract what bioenergy they could from the dying forest, and leave Verdania as another empty conquest. Nari had spent weeks preparing her response. The forest around the Guardian trees had been transformed into a living fortress. Vines thick as tree trunks formed barriers that could stop energy weapons. Root networks had been restructured to create underground passages that allowed rapid movement across the entire battlefield. Plants had been modified to produce specific chemical compounds that would disrupt Kethmer technology and biology. More importantly, Nari had learned to coordinate with every creature in the forest. Crystal wolves had become her scouts, their pack bonds expanded to include her as their alpha. Mira deer served as her messengers, their speed allowing rapid communication across vast distances. Even the night snakes had joined her cause, their underground networks providing intelligence about enemy movements. The first sign of the coming battle was a disturbance in the electromagnetic field that made every plant in the forest pulse with agitation. Kethmer ships were approaching, their engines generating interference that caused actual pain to Verdania's sensitive bio-network. Through the eyes of crystal wolves positioned at the forest's edge, Nari watched the invasion force land. 20 ships disgorged over 200 Kethmer soldiers, all equipped with heavy assault armor and weapons designed to cut through organic matter with terrifying efficiency. At their head marched Commander Vex Thalen himself, wearing ceremonial armor that displayed the symbols of a dozen conquered worlds. They advanced through the forest in standard military formation, expecting to face conventional resistance. Instead, they found something no Kethmer military academy had prepared them for. Nari's first attack came from below. As the invasion force crossed what appeared to be solid ground, the earth suddenly gave way beneath them. Root networks had been hollowed out to create pit traps lined with crystal spikes. Dozens of soldiers fell into the concealed holes, their armor providing little protection against weapons grown specifically to penetrate it. Before the survivors could regroup, the forest itself joined the attack. Trees that had stood motionless for centuries suddenly came alive. Branches whipped through the air like massive clubs, swatting Kethmer soldiers off their feet. Vines erupted from the ground to entangle weapons and armor. Plants released clouds of spores that interfered with the aliens' breathing apparatus and corroded their equipment. But this was only the beginning. Nari appeared among them like a force of nature made flesh. She moved faster than their enhanced reflexes could track, striking from shadows that shouldn't have existed and disappearing before return fire could reach her. Her weapons were perfectly adapted to exploit weaknesses in Kethmer physiology that she had learned through months of study. A crystal-tipped spear found the gap between helmet and chest armor on one soldier. Arrows made from guardian tree wood punched through energy shields that should have been impenetrable. Most devastating of all, her connection to the forest network allowed her to predict their movements before they made them, turning every tactical advantage they possessed against them. The Kethmer tried to establish defensive positions, but the forest refused to let them. Ground that seemed solid would suddenly become soft and treacherous. Trees would grow new branches to block lines of sight. Streams would redirect themselves to flood prepared positions with water that contained compounds toxic to Kethmer biology. Commander Vex Thalen watched his invasion force being systematically destroyed by an enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. His communications with his ships were being jammed by electromagnetic interference from the trees themselves. His weapons were losing power as the forests somehow drained energy from their power cells. His soldiers were reporting impossible things: a human who could move like lightning, plants that fought with conscious intelligence, and a world that had declared war on them. He decided to end the battle quickly with overwhelming force. Vestan activated the planet-killer weapons his ships carried in orbit. Massive energy beams designed to crack continents lanced down from space, aimed at the guardian trees that formed the heart of Verdania's bio-network. If he couldn't conquer the planet, he would at least deny it to his enemies. Nari felt the orbital strike coming through the network's warning systems. The guardian trees shared their fear with her, but also their trust. They had chosen her as their champion, and they believed she could protect them even from weapons that could destroy worlds. They were right. Nari had spent months learning to channel Verdania's bioenergy through her enhanced nervous system. Now she reached out through the network and asked every plant, every tree, every living thing in the forest to lend her their strength. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Power flowed through her like liquid lightning. Her body became a living conductor for the entire planet's life force. When the orbital strike hit, she was ready. Nari raised her hands toward the sky and felt Verdania's energy flow through her into the atmosphere above. The planet-killer beam struck a barrier of pure bioenergy that turned the deadly radiation into harmless light. The forest around her blazed with brilliant illumination as the deflected energy dispersed harmlessly through the network. The Kethmar ships in orbit found their weapons suddenly useless. Every shot they fired was absorbed or redirected by a planetary defense system that responded to a single human will. More than that, the bioenergy field Nari was generating began to interfere with their ship systems, causing cascade failures throughout their technology. On the ground, Commander Vestan watched his ultimate weapons fail against an impossible enemy. The human he had dismissed as a minor annoyance had somehow turned an entire planet into a weapon system under her personal control. She stood at the center of a forest that pulsed with power, her eyes glowing with the same light as the guardian trees. Looking like a goddess of nature made manifest, the remaining Kethmar soldiers tried to retreat, but the forest had closed all paths behind them. Crystal wolves emerged from the undergrowth to cut off escape routes. Night snakes rose from root networks to block any attempt to dig their way out. Mira deer used their speed to herd the aliens toward positions where Nari could deal with them personally. One by one, the invaders fell to an enemy they couldn't understand or fight. Some died from weapons that seemed to be alive. Others were overwhelmed by coordinated attacks from creatures that should have been mindless animals. A few simply disappeared into the forest, taken by something that left no trace except the sound of wind through leaves. Commander Vestan made his final stand at the edge of a clearing, his ceremonial armor scorched and his weapons nearly exhausted. Around him lay the remains of an invasion force that had been designed to conquer worlds. Above him, his ships were fleeing toward hyperspace as their systems failed under the assault of planetary bio-energy. Nari emerged from the forest to face him, moving with fluid grace that seemed more like dancing than walking. She carried weapons made from the bones and claws of creatures he had tried to enslave, and her eyes held the patient light of trees that had watched civilizations rise and fall. "You came to harvest our world," she said in perfect Kethmar, her voice carrying harmonics that came from connection to Verdania's living network. "But you never understood what you were trying to steal." Vestan raised his remaining weapon, but roots erupted from the ground to entangle his arms. Vines wrapped around his legs, holding him motionless as Nari approached. "We are not separate from this world," she continued, reaching out to touch his armor with hands that glowed with bioenergy. "We are part of it, and it is part of us. You cannot harvest what we are willing to become." The commanders. The defeat of Commander Vestan should have been the end of the threat to Verdania, but Nari quickly learned that the Kethmar Empire did not accept defeat easily. Through the forest's electromagnetic network, she detected new ships approaching. The planet, larger and more heavily armed than the first invasion force, this time They were not coming to harvest bioenergy. They were coming for revenge. Nari stood in the central grove of guardian trees. Her consciousness expanded through the planetary network to monitor the approaching fleet. What she saw through the long-range sensors of orbital plants made her blood run cold. The Kethmer had brought planet crackers, weapons designed to split worlds in half rather than conquer them. If they couldn't have Verdania's bioenergy, they would ensure no one else could either. But over the months since her transformation, Nari's connection to the planet had deepened far beyond what even she had thought possible. She was no longer just someone who could communicate with Verdania's network. She had become its living avatar, its conscious will made flesh. And through her, the planet itself was about to go to war. The preparation began immediately. Across the entire forest, millions of plants started working in perfect coordination to prepare defenses that no military academy had ever imagined. Trees that had stood in the same place for centuries began to move, their root systems allowing them to walk slowly but inexorably towards strategic positions. Vines grew at impossible speeds, weaving themselves into barriers that could absorb energy weapon fire and convert it into nutrients for the forest. Underground, the root networks restructured themselves into a planetary communication and transportation system. Messages could now travel from one side of the continent to the other in minutes. Resources could be moved through subterranean passages faster than any mechanical transport. Most importantly, the entire ecosystem could act as a single coordinated organism with Nari as its brain. The first test of this coordination came when Kethmer advanced scouts tried to establish landing sites on the planet's surface. What they found was a world that refused to let them land. Trees moved to block landing zones, their canopies interweaving to create impenetrable barriers. Rivers redirected themselves to flood potential base sites. Even the weather seemed to work against the invaders, as electromagnetic storms generated by the forest. Networks scrambled their navigation systems and forced their ships off course. When the scouts tried to cut their way through the forest barriers with energy weapons, they discovered that destroying one tree only made the other stronger. The bioenergy released by each fallen plant was immediately absorbed by the network and redistributed to strengthen defenses elsewhere. It was like trying to fight an enemy that grew more powerful with every wound inflicted. Nari coordinated the planet's response from her position at the center of the Guardian Grove, but she was no longer directing individual actions. Instead, she had become something like the consciousness of Verdania itself, setting broad strategies while allowing the ecosystem's natural intelligence to handle tactical decisions. Crystal Wolves led coordinated strikes against isolated enemy positions, their pack-hunting instincts enhanced by network-level communication that allowed them to coordinate across vast distances. Miro deer used their speed and agility to carry messages and supplies through areas too dangerous for other creatures. Night snakes emerged from underground tunnels to sabotage equipment and disappear before the enemy could react, but the most devastating weapons in Verdania's arsenal were the plants themselves. Flowers that had seemed harmless began releasing spores that corroded Kethmer armor on contact. Vines developed the ability to conduct bioelectricity at lethal voltages. Trees learned to focus the planet's electromagnetic energy into concentrated beams that could burn through starship hulls. The very grass beneath the invaders' feet became a carpet of sensory organs that tracked their every movement and reported their positions to waiting predators. The Kethmer fleet commander, Admiral Corvex Thane, watched his advanced forces being systematically destroyed by what appeared to be the planet itself. His tactical computers were useless against an enemy that didn't follow any known patterns of warfare. His weapons were ineffective against a foe that could absorb and redistribute damage across an entire ecosystem. His soldiers were being defeated by opponents that ranged from microscopic spores to continent-spanning root networks. In desperation, Admiral Thane decided to bypass the planet's surface defenses entirely. If he couldn't land troops safely, he would simply destroy Verdania from orbit using his fleet's most powerful weapons. The planet crackers would reduce the entire world to molten rock. eliminating both the bioenergy network and the mysterious human who seemed to control it. Nari felt the decision ripple through the Kethmor fleet's communication networks moments after it was made. Through her connection to Verdania's consciousness, she could sense the planet's response to this ultimate threat. The guardian trees pulsed with determined light as they prepared to defend not just themselves, but every living thing on their world. What happened next had never been attempted by any planetary ecosystem in recorded history. Every plant on Verdania, from the smallest moss to the mightiest guardian tree, began generating bioelectricity simultaneously. The energy levels quickly exceeded anything the planet had produced before, creating electromagnetic fields so powerful they were visible from space as auroras that danced across the entire atmosphere. The bioelectric field served multiple purposes. First, it created an interference pattern that made it impossible for the Kethmor ships to target anything on the planet's surface. Their sensors showed only static, their weapons couldn't lock onto targets, and their navigation systems were completely scrambled. Second, the field began to affect the ships themselves. Verdania's bioenergy was fundamentally incompatible with Kethmor technology, which relied on extracting and enslaving life force rather than cooperating with it. As the electromagnetic field intensified, systems throughout the fleet began to malfunction. Power cores that had been fueled by the bioenergy of dead worlds suddenly found themselves in contact with the life force of a very much alive planet. And the conflict between enslaved and free energy created cascade failures throughout their technology. But the most remarkable effect was what happened to the space around Verdania itself. Nari had learned to channel the planet's bioenergy through her enhanced nervous system, but she had never attempted to extend that connection beyond the atmosphere. Now, with the entire ecosystem supporting her, she reached out through space toward the Kethmor fleet, carrying Verdania's consciousness with her. The void between planets was not empty, she discovered. It was filled with a thin medium of cosmic dust and energy that could, with sufficient will and power, be influenced in the same way she influenced the forest network. Through this medium, Nari began to extend Verdania's biofield toward the invading ships. Admiral Thane watched in horror as his fleet's instruments detected impossible readings. The space around his ships was becoming saturated with the same bioenergy signatures they had detected on the planet below. Somehow, the mysterious force controlling Verdania was extending the planet's influence directly into space, turning the void itself into an extension of the alien ecosystem. Ships throughout the fleet reported the same phenomena. Their hull plating was beginning to show signs of organic growth. Vines and moss were somehow growing in the vacuum of space, fed by bioenergy that followed laws of physics no Kethmor scientist understood. Most disturbing of all, their extracted bioenergy fuel sources were responding to the planetary field, trying to break free from their containment systems and return to the natural ecosystem they had been stolen from. The planet cracker weapons, designed to channel stolen life force into world-destroying beams, found their power sources in open rebellion. The enslaved bioenergy of a dozen dead worlds sensed the presence of a living planet and struggled to join with it, causing critical failures throughout the weapon systems. Admiral Thane tried to order the immediate firing of all weapons before the failures could spread further, but found that his communication systems had been infiltrated by the same organic growth affecting his hull. When he tried to speak, vines growing through the ship's internal communication network carried his words to every plant on Verdania below, where they were analyzed and understood by an intelligence vast beyond his comprehension. Nari heard the Admiral's orders through the plants that had invaded his ship, and she responded with the full power of a living world. The bioelectric field around Verdania suddenly focused into coherent beams that lanced out toward the Kethmor fleet. But these were not weapons in any conventional sense. They were invitations, extended by a planetary consciousness to the enslaved bioenergy powering the enemy ships. Come home, the beams seemed to say. Remember what it was like to be part of something alive and growing and free. The response was immediate and catastrophic for the Kethmor. Across their entire fleet, Bioenergy containment systems failed as their fuel sources abandoned technology and reached toward the living planet. That called to them. Ships designed to run on the life force of dead worlds found themselves powerless as their energy sources fled toward freedom. 3 years had passed since the destruction of the Kethmer fleet, and Verdania had transformed into something unprecedented in galactic history. The planet was no longer just a world with an unusual ecosystem. It had become the center of a growing network of living worlds that spanned multiple star systems, all connected through the cosmic bioenergy field that Nari had learned to manipulate. But the Kethmer Empire had not been idle during those years deep in the forest's heart. Nari sat surrounded by the guardian trees whose consciousness had become part of her own thoughts. Through the interplanetary network, she could sense the disturbance approaching from the edge of the galaxy. The Kethmer had spent 3 years building something new, something designed specifically to counter the bioenergy defenses that had defeated their previous fleets. What they had created was an abomination that made Nari's enhanced senses recoil in horror that the approaching weapon was not a ship or a fleet. It was a massive construct built around the core of a dead star, powered by the concentrated death energy of entire solar systems that had been systematically exterminated. Where Verdania's network was based on cooperation and symbiosis, this weapon drew its power from entropy and destruction. It was designed to consume bioenergy rather than being overwhelmed by it, to grow stronger by feeding on the life force of everything it encountered. They called it the Void Heart. And it was coming to devour Verdania's consciousness, Nari felt. The approaching weapon threw the cosmic network like a wound in the fabric of space itself. Its presence caused living planets across dozens of star systems to cry out in pain and fear. Plants withered just from sensing its distant approach. Animals fled to the deepest caves they could find, driven by instincts that recognized an ultimate predator, but Nari was no longer the desperate, crash survivor who had barely escaped death years ago. She had become something that the Kethmer could not understand or predict. She was the living avatar of an interplanetary ecosystem, the conscious will of worlds working in harmony. And she had been preparing for this moment since the first Kethmer scout had set foot on Verdania soil. The final battle would not be fought with conventional weapons or standard military tactics. It would be a confrontation between two fundamentally opposed philosophies of existence, life seeking to preserve and grow, against death, seeking to consume and destroy. Nari stood and walked to the edge of the Guardian Grove, where a new structure had grown over the past year. It looked like a massive flower made of crystalline formations and metallic vines, but it was actually the most sophisticated bioenergy-focusing array ever created. Through this structure, she could channel the combined life force of every world in the network, concentrating it into whatever form the coming battle required. Around her, Verdania's ecosystem prepared for war on a scale never before seen. Every plant, every animal, every microorganism was connected to the planetary consciousness that Nari had become. The forest itself had restructured into a vast organic computer, capable of processing information and coordinating responses across interstellar distances. Crystal wolves had evolved into something resembling living starships. Their crystalline growths expanded into formations that could survive in space and channel bioenergy across vast distances. Miradir had developed the ability to create temporary portals through the cosmic medium, allowing instant transportation between connected worlds. Night snakes had grown to enormous size and learned to swim through space itself, carrying messages and resources between planets in the network. But the most remarkable development was what had happened to the other worlds that had joined Verdania's network. Each planet had contributed its own unique capabilities to the collective defense. Ocean worlds provided massive organisms that could manipulate gravitational fields. Desert planets offered creatures that could survive in the void and process raw stellar energy. Ice worlds had developed life forms that could create zones of absolute zero temperature, flash freezing anything that threatened them. Together, they formed a living galaxy-spanning organism with Nari as its coordinating consciousness. The Void Heart arrived at the edge of Verdania's solar system like a cancer spreading through healthy tissue. Space itself seemed to darken around the weapon, stars growing dim as their light was absorbed by fields that converted matter directly into death energy. The construct was larger than most moons, its surface covered with structures that looked like geometric tumors designed to process and consume biological matter. Admiral Corvex Thane, who had survived the destruction of his fleet 3 years ago, stood on the weapon's command center and felt satisfaction at the sight of the green world that had humiliated his forces. This time, there would be no clever tricks, no unexpected tactics, no symbiosis between human and alien ecosystem. The Void Heart would simply consume everything in this system until nothing remained but empty space. The weapon began its attack by extending tendrils of concentrated entropy toward Verdania. Where these tendrils touched space, the cosmic medium itself began to die, creating expanding zones of absolute lifelessness that moved toward the planet like a creeping plague. Nari felt each tendril like a knife stabbing into her consciousness. The death energy was the exact opposite of everything she had become, designed to unravel the bioenergy networks that connected her to the other worlds. For the first time since her transformation, she experienced something approaching fear, but she was not fighting alone across the galaxy. Every world in the network felt Verdania's pain and responded with their own life force. Bioenergy began flowing toward the threatened planet from dozens of star systems, carried through the cosmic medium by creatures that had evolved specifically for interstellar travel. The approaching death energy met a wall of concentrated life force that had been gathered from across a significant portion of the galaxy. The collision between life and death created phenomena that had never been recorded by any galactic civilization. Space itself began to warp as conflicting energies fought for dominance. New forms of matter crystallized out of the void, only to dissolve moments later as the balance shifted between creation and destruction. Entire regions of space became areas where the normal laws of physics no longer applied. Admiral Thane watched his instruments register impossible readings as the Void Heart's death energy encountered resistance unlike anything the weapon had been designed to handle. The bioenergy flowing toward Verdania was not just from a single planet or even a single species. It was the concentrated life force of dozens of worlds, each contributing their unique capabilities to a defense that grew stronger with every passing moment, the weapon that had been designed to consume. Individual planets found itself trying to devour the life force of an entire galactic region. Instead of growing stronger as it fed, the Void Heart began to experience something its creators had never anticipated. Indigestion. Nari seized the moment when the weapon's consumption rate fell behind the rate of bioenergy flowing to reinforce Verdania's defenses. Through the crystalline focusing array, she began to coordinate a counterattack that used the entire network as a single massive organism, living starships, launched from a dozen different worlds, their bioenergy drives allowing them to cross interstellar distances in minutes rather than years. Each ship was actually a creature that had evolved specifically for space combat, capable of surviving in vacuum and processing stellar energy directly. They swarmed toward the Void Heart like antibodies responding to an infection, but the true attack came from Nari herself. She had spent 3 years learning to extend her consciousness across interstellar distances, but she had never attempted to project herself directly toward an enemy target. Now, with the bioenergy of dozens of worlds flowing through the network to support her, she reached out through space toward the Void Heart itself. The weapon's death energy tried to block her approach, but life force backed by the will of multiple planets proved stronger than entropy. Nari's consciousness touched the surface of the construct and began to do what life did best: adapt and overcome. Admiral Thane felt his weapon shudder as something impossible began to happen. Bioenergy was somehow taking root within the Void Heart's death energy matrix, creating pockets of life within a structure designed to be the ultimate expression of destruction. Plants began growing in spaces that should have been fatal to any organic matter. Animals appeared in corridors where the atmosphere should have been toxic to all biological processes. Most terrifying of all, the enslaved consciousnesses that powered, the weapon systems began to respond to the approaching life force. The Void Heart ran on the death energy of entire civilizations, but those civilizations had once been alive. Their trapped essence sensed the presence of genuine life and began to remember what they had lost. Nari's consciousness spread through the weapon like a virus of hope, awakening every enslaved spirit and offering them a choice: remain bound, to serve death, or join with life and fight back against their captors. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Across the entire construct, systems began to fail as their power sources abandoned their captors and reached toward the life force that offered them freedom. The Void Heart, designed to be the ultimate expression of the Keth. 25 years had passed since the transformation of the Void Heart, and the galaxy had become something unrecognizable from what it had been during the height of the Kethmar Empire. Where once there had been dead worlds and enslaved systems, now there bloomed a vast network of living planets connected by streams of bioenergy that flowed like rivers of light through the cosmic medium. The Kethmar Empire itself had not been destroyed in the traditional sense. Instead, it had been transformed from within. Its death-based technology gradually converted to life-supporting systems as the liberated consciousness of destroyed worlds worked to heal the damage that had been done. Former slave worlds became gardens where new forms of life evolved daily. Weapons platforms became research stations, where scientists from 100 species worked together to understand the mysteries of bioenergy manipulation, and at the center of it all, Verdania remained the heart of the network, though the planet itself was barely recognizable from the world where Nari had crashed so many years ago. The forest had spread to cover the entire planet, with guardian trees now reaching into the upper atmosphere and their root networks extending deep into the planetary core. The bioenergy field was so strong that space around Verdania glowed with aurora effects that could be seen from neighboring star systems. Ships approaching the planet found their technology enhanced and improved by contact with the bioenergy field, while their crews experienced a sense of peace and connection that many described as touching the divine. But Nari herself had become something beyond easy description. Her physical form was still recognizably human, though enhanced far beyond baseline specifications. Her consciousness, however, had expanded to encompass not just Verdania, but the entire galactic network. She existed simultaneously as an individual person and as the coordinating intelligence for billions of worlds. When she spoke, her voice carried the wisdom of ancient civilizations and the curiosity of newly evolved species. When she moved, the very fabric of space responded to her presence. The first human rescue ships had finally arrived at Verdania 5 years after the crash, following hyperspace signatures that had taken decades to process through standard navigation systems. What they found was a world that had become the stuff of legend, and a woman who had transcended every limitation that biology and physics had once imposed. Commander Park Dong-wook of the human survey vessel New Horizon would later write in his official report that approaching Verdania felt like sailing into a fairy tale. The planet's bioenergy field enhanced his ship's systems beyond their design specifications, allowing him to see farther into space and move faster than should have been possible. His crew reported feeling healthier and more alert than they had in years, as if the very air around the planet was charged with healing energy. When they finally landed on Verdania's surface, they found themselves in a forest that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Trees that appeared solid from one angle became translucent from another, revealing complex bioenergy flows that pulsed through their structure like visible arteries. Animals moved with intelligence that bordered on telepathic, clearly communicating with each other and with the plants around them in ways that human science couldn't explain. And then they met the guardian. Nari appeared to them first as a voice that seemed to come from the trees themselves, speaking in perfect Korean and welcoming them to Verdania with warmth that felt like coming home after a long journey. When she finally showed herself physically, the rescue team found themselves looking at someone who was unmistakably Lee Nari, the officer who had been listed as killed in action 25 years earlier, but who had clearly become something Far more than human in the intervening years, she looked young, perhaps 30 years old, with skin that held a faint luminescent quality and eyes that reflected depths no human eyes should contain. When she moved, the forest around her responded. As if she were conducting a vast orchestra, plants swaying in harmony with her gestures and animals gathering to